This is week 6 of the winter trimester. The winter trimester. This whole time for 5 weeks I've been saying it's the spring trimester. I don't know why, because it's winter, maybe because I'm used to semesters where you have the fall and spring semester, but this is trimesters, so it is the winter trimester. I'm Jennifer Marie and this is my Atelier diary. So this week did not go quite as planned. This was the first week that we're starting a new long pose figure drawing / painting, and the figure paintings normally last for 5 weeks, though this first week we have a new model named Britney, and she came in to do the pose, and we started drawing her, and about halfway through or maybe an hour into it she got dizzy and ended up fainting, though she was kind of knew it was coming on, so she sort of was kind of going into to sit down. So instead of falling straight back, she kind of crumpled down, which is better. But anyways, she was feeling pretty dizzy, so we ended up sending her home so she could rest up and hopefully get better. The next day, on Tuesday, then she said she was still feeling faint, so she couldn't come in, so we ended up getting Brian for a 2-day pose. So he came in Tuesday and Wednesday, and so I ended up doing a color study. And this was actually really good because color studies I think are something that are good and valuable for learning how to mess around and experiment with color, but I've never been so totally happy with my color studies before. So Brian got in his pose, and then I was talking to Matt on how to build up a color study. And I know that you start off doing a shadow shape, and then you will make sure that the balance between the shadow shape, or the value range between the shadow shape and the background are in unison. But then when I start to move into the lights, I will start from the shadow shape and I'll work my way up into the lights. But starting in the shadow shape and working up into the lights, I'm then, to get everything to kind of gradually go to the lights, I end up mixing a ton of colors, and things get muddy pretty fast typically, and I kind of lose the light, and then the color study ends up being really dark. So Matt was saying that instead of doing it that way, start off the same way that I've been doing, which is finding the shadow shape and the background together. And so then once you have those in, moving into the lights, you start at your brightest light and get that in, and then you will work into the shadow shape. And so doing that made a lot more sense, and we were talking about how it even kind of relates to when you start to build a drawing up, you want to keep everything really simplified and making sure that you're working on the whole image. So if you're finding the line for the top of the head, the next thing you do is you find the line for the bottom of the foot, or if you work on a shoulder, you're gonna find a complementing line that's far away from the figure, or as far away from that line as possible. So maybe shoulder to the hip or shoulder to the foot. So you're working around the whole figure that way. And so when you're starting then in the shadows, once you get the shadows in and the background in, do something that's the farthest away value-wise from the shadow, which would be the brightest light. So doing that, it even simplified my palette, because instead of mixing all these transitions that go up to the light, I had my shadow, and then I went into the lights and I would pull that down, and I then needed to mix up a color that would go from the brightest light down to a mid-tone, and then a mid-tone into a half-tone. So I ended up mixing up a lot less values as well, so it simplified it and made everything a lot less confusing. And honestly, doing this way too, it was a lot of mixing then on the canvas to get things to blend together, rather than mixing up a bunch of transitions on my palette. And so that was kind of all the time I had to do on the first day. So then the next day, on Wednesday, when Brian came in for the last day of the color study, I just worked on unifying everything, so making sure that the transitions were as gradual as they needed to be. And then I started really getting to experiment with color. So since I felt like I'd gotten the transitions as gradual as they needed to be, then I could experiment with getting different colors in there. Like, for example, around his shoulder blades, I have a nice green in there that I could just lay on top of, since the transitions were right, and so I mixed up the exact color of green and the exact value that I needed, so I could just lay it on, and it kind of harmonized value wise and transitions wise with everything. So I'm also noticing is if I'm keeping like start off with the transitions of values and getting the values nailed down, then when I'm putting in more or different colors, like a green on top of a pinky color or something like that, I'm able to just lay it on. And if the value of that color is matching right to the value that I already have down, I don't have to do too much mixing on the canvas. I can just lay it right down. So trying to get things to look like skin and all the color that's in it. So I started off with Brian being pretty pinky or orangey, and then so this day I ended up putting a lot more blues, purples, and greens on it. Really happy with how this one turned out, doing this method of shadow shape background to lightest light and then working in really made a lot of sense to me and helped a lot. And doing these color studies, it's fun to experiment with colors more, so I hope that I can do a lot more of these color studies because I feel like I really got a lot out of it. And then Thursday, Brittany was planning on coming in again to try and do that long pose again, but she canceled in the morning because she was feeling faint again, so we don't want her to hurt herself or anything like that, so that was totally fine. And we ended up not being able to get a replacement model for the day, which was also fine because I have been planning on doing this really big master copy of the Solomon J. Solomon painting of Samson, and I have the canvas built already and it's toned, so I'm ready to go to start drawing on it. So I ended up working on that this morning. And so the canvas is really big. It's 8 foot by 5 1/3 feet, and I have a black and white print of this painting made, and I think that's a little bit smaller than 36 by 48. So what I ended up doing was I put a graph on the print and then the same exact squares, and they were the same proportions. I put that up on charcoal on my canvas. And so doing the graph then will make it easier for me to make sure that I'm getting everything in the right proportion, all the figures and the whole drawing up there. So I'm using really soft charcoal. I'm using Nitram, the yellow sticks, which is a really soft charcoal, so it'll wipe off easily and go on easily without taking up too much of the imprimatur that's already on there. Doing this really big is really fun because there's just like a lot of huge arm movements that you get to do to put it on. And then I am making a lot of mistakes because working this big, especially from a print that's smaller and getting it this big, I'm just making mistakes, which is, I'm sure, normal. So to get the charcoal off, I have a pretty stiff fan brush that I've been using. So I'll put a line of charcoal on, and then if I need to take it off, I'll take a brush and just wipe it off, and it wipes off really easily. My goal is to get the drawing done in charcoal as precise as I can by the end of, well, this is the winter trimester, and then we have a spring trimester, and then we have our summer break. So I want to get the drawing done before summer break, so then over the summer I can be really focused on working on just the painting part. And then Friday, we knew that Brittany wasn't coming in that day, so we already had scheduled Kevin to come in, and Matt put him in a pose that just in case Brittany felt like she wasn't comfortable doing the pose because she was still feeling dizzy or whatever, and we don't want her to hurt herself or anything like that, we put Kevin in a pose that he might be filling in for the rest of the long pose. So for that, just in case this was the first day of Kevin doing the long pose, I ended up starting a transfer drawing. So this is just Canson paper and just trying to get the main gestural lines and proportions and everything like that of the figure in with charcoal. And the drawing's fine, but kind of at the end of the day, he started having his arm more out, and doing that, he started to lean forward more, which is a little different than what I first captured in the drawing, but I like the new pose of him kind of leaning more with his arm out more, which means that his hand went off the page, but I'll make sure that if I end up painting this, that the hand will be in the painting. I'll make it wide enough. But also I do like the gesture more of that lean. It's kind of more just a nicer gesture that I like more. So I think I might shift some things around if we have more days of this pose, so I can get that more intense gesture. And now for my cast painting, still working on just adjusting things, working on trying to get the values more accurate, trying to get the temperature shifts and the colors more accurate. I noticed when I was doing this that I started at the top and I started working across the painting in horizontal strips, and then once I finished that, I started on either side of the painting and then worked in vertical strips. And I'm not saying that this is something that I'm going to be doing each time I do a painting. I just noticed that this just happened this time and I thought it was interesting, so I would say it. But doing that, I think, is kind of nice, because when I'm working on strips across the whole painting, I feel like I'm treating the image equally and that I'm working on the impression of light hitting an object rather than just like painting a baby's arm or a baby's chest or something like that. I'm just kind of working over how light's hitting a plaster object as I move across it. And another interesting thing about the image as a whole is that the image is a plaster cast that's hanging on a cement looking wall. And so Matt was saying something that I could do to show these two different textures was how I was putting the paint down. So for the strip of the background that's that cement looking wall, he showed me how I could put paint on my palette knife, a little bit of a lighter value, and kind of rub it onto the cement looking wall part, which would give it a different texture than the plaster cast, which it did. It kind of gave it this I can't say that word, spackly texture to it. So if this was my palette knife, I would put it onto my palette and kind of get just a little bit of paint on it, but pretty even. And so then if this is my canvas, I would just take that palette knife and either go like this on it or just kind of rub it over it, so the paint wasn't really going on the canvas evenly, but kind of catching on the weave of the canvas and pulling that paint off the palette knife. So it did give it this like spotty, cementy looking texture, which I think I'll keep doing that and experimenting with different values to just get the texture to look a little bit more evident, because it's pretty subtle right now. And lastly, I wanted to show you this drawing. I did this on Tuesday evening of a 2-hour figure drawing of Sin.